And we're live, and so welcome. So in this video, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this word doulos, which we find in the Greek New Testament. We find it quite a lot in the Greek New Testament, and when we do, it's translated normally either as slave or as servant. More often throughout the last few hundred years, it's been as servant, and some people have regarded this as a cover-up because it tends to hide and obfuscate what it means to be a Christian. And I tend to agree with that view. So in this video, what we're going to do is going to look at this word. It's going to just sort of trace it through certain texts that we find. We're going to compare some of the translations, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what a slave actually is. So let's get into it by starting about, first of all, why is it that this is such an issue? And it goes back to the issue of translation generally. You see, the problem is that when people read something that's been translated from another time and place and culture, the people reading it are bringing their own worldview into that translation, which means that really it's kind of hard for them to understand often what the original author meant. And today we have this problem. Now, let me just give you an extreme example of this so you understand kind of some of the challenges that translators sometimes have. Let's say, for instance, you are taking the Greek New Testament and you're going to translate it for a people who live in a remote island in the middle of the Pacific somewhere who have no idea what sheep or what lambs are, right? This is a real challenge because if you're talking about the Lamb of God and they've never seen a sheep or a lamb, how are you going to translate that concept to them? And so maybe they're used to having pigs and they eat pigs, and maybe they use the skin of pigs for different things. And so there's comparability to how pigs are used to how lambs are used. But does that mean that you should go and translate, behold, the pig of God that takes away the sins of the world? I wouldn't do that. And I don't think that's a really wise thing to do. And so we end up changing the meaning of words, and sometimes, anyway, the challenge is to try and bring the original author's intent and teach that so that people understand it. Now, the challenge we have when it comes to slavery, of course, is that over the last few hundred years, really it's probably longer than that, really, but over the last 500 years, we've had this Western slavery, which is very different to what the original authors would have experienced when it comes to slavery. And this means that when they said the word doulos, slave, what they understood and what we understood are quite different things. And this is one of the reasons why this is so difficult. We have now a real hang-up, and I think rightly so, about slavery, particularly the way slavery was used over that multi-year period, that multi-century period, and we're still feeling the repercussions of this today. And so it's right that we have some aversion to the concept of slavery in general. And it's interesting just to sort of see some of the translations and how they approach this, even within their footnotes as well. So let's talk briefly then about what it meant in the first century to be a slave compared to what we understand to be a slave. Now, there are two things that are very similar between ancient slavery and modern slavery. The first of these, of course, is the idea of ownership. Just like in both modern slavery and ancient slavery, the idea of being a slave meant that you were owned by another person. You were regarded as property. You could be traded and sold and things like this. So this was one of those things that we see when it comes to people who are, when it comes to slavery, there was a similarity in that sense. You therefore lost your rights as an individual to go and do whatever you want. You no longer had slavery, and that's really the second similarity. Just like you didn't belong to yourself, you didn't have freedom. Also, you didn't have the ability to go and do whatever you wanted to do. Your time, your energy was intended to be given over to a particular individual. And so that's really the two similarities that we have between modern slavery and ancient slavery. There are a number of differences though, and probably the most important difference is that modern slavery was really driven by racial idealism, right? A wrong understanding of what it means to be have different skin colors and so on. This was really what drives modern slavery, but that was not the case in the ancient world. In fact, if you were in, say, the city of Philippi and around the first century and you saw a slave there, he wouldn't look a whole lot different to the people who he lived amongst. He would be of the same skin color. He would speak the same language. He would have much the same customs and background. So none of the racial disparity was there that would be that we regard as being associated with slavery today. So that wasn't an issue, and this actually has quite significant ramifications. So rather than people being bought into slavery or enslaved on the basis of their skin color, people could still be captured and enslaved back in Greco-Roman times. So if you were sort of out in the middle of the ocean, maybe you got lost and some slave traders came along, they could capture you and enslave you and sell you at a slave market. And that did happen occasionally. But also, there are other reasons and other ways that people would become slaves. A really dominant one is through debt. Right? So people would become slaves because they had taken on debt that they could not repay. And we see even Jesus using this scenario in places like Matthew chapter 18, verse, I think it's 23 onwards. We see there the parable of the manager who went and he was forgiven a debt, and then he went and enslaved somebody who couldn't pay him, and ultimately he was enslaved until he could repay that debt. And the idea being that if you owed some money, slavery was a legitimate way of actually working your way out of that slavery. And therein lies really the second really important distinction. Not only was slavery not racially oriented, but also slavery was not necessarily lifelong. Now, in the modern idea of slavery, sometimes slaves could be set free by their masters on their death by putting it in their will. It was not super common, it did happen, but in the ancient days that was much more common than it is today, and it was in the last few centuries. And so you could actually be freed from slavery, but not just through the death of your master, but even when you reach the age of, let's just say, for instance, you were sold into slavery by your parents as a child so that they could repay a debt. This was another scenario, another way people could become slaves. You can be sold into slavery. And then when you get to the age of about 30, under Roman custom, essentially, that was generally the time when you'd just be set free. Right? So particularly Roman citizens, if you were a slave to a Roman citizen and you had been there for a number of years, when you got to the age of 30 or thereabouts, often slave owners would then free their slaves. And not only that, but you could also oftentimes actually earn and buy out your own slavery. And so this really changes the way people thought about being a slave. Being a slave was actually sometimes more of a temporary approach to dealing with some of life's challenges rather than a way of sort of just seeing themselves and living their lives forever. It was a temporary thing. They looked forward often to no longer being a slave, and even sometimes when they were allowed to go or released, quite often, or not quite often, but it wasn't uncommon, at least, for a slave to choose to stay under a master, particularly if that master was a good master, or if the status of that master would then, provide that slave with additional benefits. And even if you were the slave of a Roman citizen, when you were released, and if you weren't a citizen, often you'd be granted your citizenship. So again, there are sometimes social status reasons why you might want to go through a phase of slavery. And this really changes it. This is I think the biggest distinction between what we understand as modern slavery and ancient slavery, and that is that under ancient slavery, you could get out of your slavery, you could earn your way out, you could buy your freedom, or you could just be released at a certain age or after a certain amount of service. And so that was different, because under modern slavery, you were a slave until basically life, really. And even then, maybe you might get out when your master dies, but often that wasn't the case, and you would just be regarded as part of the property. The other distinction, I think, really between ancient slavery and modern slavery is that under modern slavery, most of the people who were slaves were used for agricultural purposes. Whereas in the ancient world, most of the slaves in the ancient world were actually, they were used within a city for skilled labor. And so when they finished their time as a slave, they actually had skills that they could go and use and, set up their own stores and things like that. And even sometimes it would be that their masters would help them set those things up and take a profit. There'd be all sorts of little things like that would be set up along the way. And so the other thing, finally, is that another distinction between modern slavery and ancient slavery is that under modern slavery, there was a big difference between somebody who was freed and someone who was a slave from an equality standard. So when we think of when somebody under the 300 years ago in the southern part of North America, they would regard a slave as being, having less dignity than a freed person. And that wasn't the case in the ancient world. Certainly there were social distinctions within the ancient world. And so a slave typically would not have the same social standing as a slave master would, or as a freed person would. But nonetheless, the actual status of your master would actually make a big difference as to the status of the slave. So for instance, it was not unheard of for the slave of an emperor, for instance, to be able to order around senators, because that slave would take a lot of his status from the status of his master. And so the master that you're a slave to actually determines your status to some extent in society. And so these are some of the distinctions. So distinctions and similarities. So similarities being ownership and the lack of freedom. Distinctions and differences being not racially motivated. There's lots of reasons someone might go into slavery back in the old days. It didn't have that social stigma with it. And a lot of the reason for that was that it didn't have that, certainly didn't have any undignifying overtones to it like modern slavery does. And finally, of course, citizens were able to redeem themselves, buy out their slavery, or would just be set free after a certain amount of time. So this is the distinction. And so when we think about, we can't just take the modern ideas that we have of slavery and then apply them to what we see in Scripture. And so this leads to the question, how should we translate this word? Should we see it as servant, or should we translate it as slave? Now I want to encourage you, if you're listening along, let me know in the comments which one of these you think we should use as well. I'd love to hear from you there too. Now let's turn to the translations a little bit. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to share with you just briefly, let's just start by looking at some of the Greek texts here. This is the Tyndale Greek New Testament, Titus 1:1. And we see very clearly here that Paul regards himself as a doulos theo apostolos de Jesu Christou, right? So you've got Paul, who is a slave of God. Now, this is not the only place that Paul regards himself or refers to himself as a slave. He often refers to himself as a slave. We see this, for instance, in Romans 1 verse 1, Galatians 1 verse 1, Philippians 1 verse 1. Actually, it's Galatians 1 verse 10, and a number of other places as well. So he refers to himself quite a lot in this scenario. Now, here's something that's kind of interesting, though, is if we were to go outside of Paul's reference to himself, how do translations look at this? Let's look first of all at how translations refer to Paul here in Titus, and then we'll look at how translations refer to slavery more generally. So I'm going to turn on Parallel Bibles here in Logos Bible Software. Let me just shrink the size of that a little bit. And I'm just going to do a quick search here, which I saved earlier, for the word slave. And now you can see very clearly this word slave and how it's been translated in each of these contexts, or each of these different translations. So you can see here on the left we have our Greek. In the second column here we have the New American Standard, which translates it's Paul, a bondservant of God. Then we have the Holman Christian Standard, which has made a deliberate choice to actually translate doulos as slave, and so they do so there, Paul, a slave of God. Then we have the New English Translation, or the Net Bible, which has slave. Then the English Standard Bible, which uses servant. And then finally the NIV, which uses servant. Now, all of this is really interesting, but again, this is just as Paul is referring to himself. And this has some huge connotations about how does Paul think about himself as a slave? And does he see himself as a servant or a slave? And how do the different translations render that? But we can go to another passage where we're talking about somebody else who is a slave. How do translations translate that there? Well, let's go back and take another look at that. And here what we can do is we can go to Philemon, verse 16. Now, Philemon is written about a man called Onesimus who was a slave. And so here we have these different translations rendering the same word, doulos. You can see here it's in the accusative in this case, so you have a different ending on it. But nonetheless, here's the New American Standard, no longer as a slave. Here's the Holman, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, as a dearly beloved brother. The NET, the Net Bible, no longer as a slave, but more than a slave, as a dear brother. The English Standard Bible no longer is a bondservant, but more than a bondservant. And then finally we have the new NIV, and this is really interesting, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. What we learn from this really is that, first up, we can see that the English Standard Version is very consistent in the way that it translates this word. When Paul refers to himself as a doulos, it translates it bondservant. When Paul's talking about Philemon, or Onesimus rather, a slave, he still refers to him as a bondservant. But the NIV calls Paul a bondservant, right, or a servant, but here it calls Onesimus, using the same Greek word, a slave. So the NIV here is inconsistent. And this is not the 84 NIV, this is, I think, the 2011 NIV. The Holman Christian Standard Bible, the NET and the New American Standard, actually the NET and the Holman Christian Standard Bible are consistent, using that word doulos for slave consistently. And the New American Standard Bible is also inconsistent, referring to Paul as a bondservant, but then Onesimus is a slave. And again, like I mentioned, the Greek still has the same word for both. And just for fun, let's go over to the Legacy Standard Bible, and here again we can see in this is again Titus 1. The Legacy Standard Bible refers to it as Paul, a slave of God, and then when it comes to Philemon, verse 16, we see here that the Legacy Standard Bible also translates this as slave as well. So the Legacy Standard Bible is quite consistent, just like the what have we got? The Holman is consistent, and also the NET, the Net Bible, is also consistent. So that's interesting because the Legacy, of course, is the most recent of all of these translations. The Holman is probably the next most recent, alongside of the English Standard Bible, which is, they're about the same, and both of them have had updates since then. The Christian Standard Bible, which would be an interesting comparison, has gone away from this idea a little bit of slave, but I would suspect that they still keep it here in Philemon verse 16. So this is kind of interesting how translations have taken this. Now, this then leads to the question of, how did the New Testament authors refer to themselves and think about themselves? Now, we've seen that Paul refers to himself a number of times as a slave, right? He calls himself a slave, like I said, in Romans 1, Titus, Galatians 1 verse 10, Philippians, and so on. So he calls himself a slave pretty regularly, but it's not just Paul. Peter also refers to himself as a slave in 2 Peter 1 verse 1, and so does Jude, and so does James. And here's something that's really interesting. Regardless of whether you take this word as servant or slave, one of the fascinating things about this is that in every single one of these cases, they don't pump themselves up to be more than they are, right? Particularly Jude and James, both of whom are half-brothers of Jesus. They don't claim that status as, I am the brother of Jesus and therefore you got to listen to me because I'm from the same family. No, both of them actually say, no, we are slaves. They refer to themselves as really the lowest segment of society from a social status point of view, and again, regard themselves as those who have given up their rights for one reason or another. And I suspect here, and this is bleeding into the next point I was going to make here, but I suspect here that in each of these cases, they actually regard themselves as people who have voluntarily given themselves up. They have recognized the debt that they had, particularly a debt around sin. They now see themselves as debtors to Christ and therefore as slaves of Christ. And so this makes total sense in the overall scheme of how they might think of themselves. And therefore, because they are owned by God, owned by Christ, they say, we are no longer our own. We've been bought with a price, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, and therefore we're going to honor the Lord with our bodies, which flows into everything they do. And so they see themselves as servants, slaves, those who no longer have the rights to do whatever they want to do, but to do what their master has called them to do. And what does that mean? Well, obviously for an apostle, they've been sent as an ambassador to represent Christ, but it's not just that. This flows down to become something very practical for you and I today as well. We also, I think, are to see Christ and God as our master. We are also, I think, to see ourselves as belonging to Him and as being willing to surrender our understanding of what we could and should do in this life to Him and to His will. So we are no longer to live to do what we want to do. We're called to live to do what our Master wants us to do as well. And if by taking this word servant, and the doulos at least, and translating it as servant, it's one of those things that potentially does not help us to understand how we should look at ourselves. We see ourselves as a servant. Okay, that's good. That means that I work for someone else. And we compare that in our minds to an employer. Now, if that's the case, then we can leave the employment anytime we want. But as a slave, we don't have the right to do that. And so we see ourselves as willingly giving ourselves to this. And it's interesting, even if we look through the Old Testament and we look at, say, Joseph. Joseph found himself sold into slavery, but he never sought to get out of his slave position. He accepted the position that he was in, and he lived in that. And here's one of the things that we can learn from this, is that our circumstances, and the way we are in terms of our relationship with other people as servants, and with the Lord particularly as belonging to Him, this is only as negative as the Master to whom we belong. And I think this is the key thing. This is why I think Peter and Paul and Jude and James and others were willing to see themselves as a slave, because they were slaves not just to, some poor master somewhere, but to God Himself, to the best slave master. And so giving up rights, giving your energy and time for that owner was a privilege. And I think that's the way that I want to see my relationship with the Lord as well. But I'm interested in your position as well. What do you think? Leave a comment in the comment section below. I look forward to hearing from you there. And if you are interested in learning a little bit more about Greek, I would encourage you to go to masterntgreek.com/roadmap and download my roadmap to mastery. The idea of that is it's going to give you an overview of what the process looks like to go from zero to being able to read the New Testament fluently in the original Greek language. And so I would encourage you, as we think about this, as we think on these terms, to teach people around you the meaning of the word as it originally was for the original authors, and not to allow the modern thinking to drive how we understand Scripture. We need to go back, and this is one of the things. I leave some links to some books in the description below. You can go look at them. James Jeffers has this great book, The Greco-Roman World of the New Testament Era, where he looks at really the Old Testament or the New Testament period generally from a historical point of view to say, what was it like? What was slavery like? What was citizenship like? There's a number of other things like that. And so this is a great book just to get an overview of the Greco-Roman world. There's a couple of other books down there as well. There's a more academic book by Murray Harris, which is Slaves of Christ. And that Murray Harris is a great scholar. Anything by him is worth buying. That book down there is a fantastic book, and I recommend that to you as well. He goes through lots of details talking about how the first century saw it, how it worked through Jewish culture as well as Greek culture. So that's a well worthwhile book. And if you're interested more about how we should think about ourselves as a result of this, then John MacArthur's Slave, which is also in the comment section or the description below, you can there's a link to that down there as well, which is a much more readable and accessible book to read. So I hope this has been helpful. Don't forget to get your roadmap to mastery using this link just here, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you then. Bye-bye.